He sat in the courtroom smiling, 16 years old, chains on his wrists. He looked at the jury like they were wasting his time. He yawned when they showed the crime photos. He laughed when his name was mispronounced. This boy had killed his own grandmother, stabbed her, shot her, buried her behind her own house. Then he stole her car and ran. When they caught him, he didn't cry. He didn't say sorry. He asked for a lawyer, but the judge had already seen enough. What came next destroyed that smile and silenced the entire courtroom. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. There was a small town in East Texas where people left their doors unlocked. A place where neighbors waved from their porches and kids played outside until dark. In this town lived a woman named Evelyn Mercer. She was 68. She went to church every Sunday. She grew roses in her front yard. She kept peppermint candies in a bowl by the door. And she loved her grandson Tyler more than he ever deserved. Her son Daniel was a Gulf War veteran. Tough, quiet, a man who fixed things with his hands and solved problems with rules. He raised Tyler alone after the divorce. But Tyler didn't want rules. He wanted freedom. He wanted to be left alone. He was 16 and full of anger he couldn't explain. So Daniel made a decision. He sent Tyler to stay with Grandma Evelyn for the weekend. A quiet house, a warm meal, a woman who still believed love could fix anything. It was supposed to help. And instead, it became the worst mistake of Daniel's life. Because by Sunday morning, Evelyn was gone, and Tyler was driving north with blood on his hands. The courtroom was packed that Monday morning in the spring of 2004. Every seat taken. People standing against the back wall. Reporters squeezed into the press row with notebooks already open. The air inside felt heavy, like the room itself knew what was coming. The bailiff called for order. The judge walked in with a face carved from stone. And then the side door opened. Tyler Mercer shuffled through in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed to a chain around his waist, ankles shackled so tight he could barely walk. He was 16 years old, thin, baby-faced. His hair was combed to the side like someone had tried to make him look presentable. But nothing about what came next was presentable. He sat down at the defense table and looked around. Not like a boy accused of killing his grandmother, not like someone facing the worst charge the state of Texas could bring. He looked around like he was bored, like he had somewhere better to be. His eyes swept the gallery slowly. He spotted a cousin near the back and gave a small nod. Then the clerk began reading the charges. When she stumbled over his middle name, Tyler tilted his head and let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. A man behind her whispered something under his breath. The room shifted. Everyone had come expecting to see a scared child. What they saw instead was something that made their blood run cold. The charges were read in full. Capital murder. That phrase hit the room like a hammer on glass. Capital murder of Evelyn Ruth Mercer, age 68, his grandmother, the woman who had opened her home to him that weekend, the woman who had cooked his meals and washed his clothes and believed with everything in her heart that love could reach him. The state alleged that Tyler Mercer had shot her, stabbed her multiple times, dragged her body into the backyard, buried her in a shallow grave, staged her home to look like a burglary, and then fled across state lines in her stolen car carrying 2 of his father's firearms. Every word of that indictment was a brick, and Tyler sat through all of it like he was listening to a weather report. The prosecutor was a woman named Sandra Killian, mid-50s, short gray hair, glasses that she only put on when she wanted the jury to pay attention. She had tried dozens of murder cases in this county, but this one was different. She told the court that this was not a tragedy born from one moment of madness. This was a sequence, a staircase of choices, each one made after the defendant had time to stop, time to call for help, time to feel something for the woman bleeding on the kitchen floor. And each time, she said, He chose himself. He chose silence. He chose escape. He chose to bury the only person in his family who still believed in him. Tyler's defense attorney was a man named Harold Benson. Tall, gray-bearded, slow-spoken. He had taken the case because he believed every child deserved a voice in court, no matter what they were accused of. He stood and told the jury that they would hear terrible things. He did not deny that. But he asked them to remember one fact above all others. His client was 16 years old, a child under the law, a boy whose brain had not finished growing, a boy from a broken home who had been drinking that night and made a catastrophic decision in a fog of anger and alcohol. Benson did not ask for sympathy. He asked for perspective. The jury listened, but their eyes kept drifting back to Tyler, and what they saw on his face did not match the word child. Daniel Mercer sat 3 rows behind the prosecution table. He wore a dark suit and a tie that was knotted too tight. His back was straight. His hands were flat on his knees. He did not move. He barely blinked. He was a Gulf War veteran who had spent 20 years in the Army learning how to absorb pain without showing it. But this was not a battlefield. This was a courtroom where one son sat in chains and one mother lay in the ground. Daniel had driven his mother to church 100 times. He had mowed her lawn every other Saturday. He had trusted her to take care of Tyler because she was the safest person he knew. Now he sat in a courtroom watching strangers describe how his son had ended her life. His jaw was locked so tight you could see the muscle pulsing beneath his skin. The judge gave preliminary instructions. He told the jury this would be a difficult trial. He told the gallery he would tolerate no outbursts. He told the attorneys to keep their arguments within bounds. And then he looked directly at Tyler. The boy met his gaze for 2 seconds, then looked away. Not in shame. In disinterest. The judge paused. The whole room paused. It was the kind of silence that doesn't need words to deliver a message. Everyone in that courtroom understood the same thing at once. This boy was not afraid. Not yet. But the wheels of justice had already started turning, and they do not stop for smirks. He thought he would never be caught. The court had already started catching him. Before there was a crime scene, before there was a courtroom, before there was a boy in chains pretending he didn't care, there was a woman who cared about everything. Evelyn Ruth Mercer was born in 1936 in a small farming community outside of Lufkin, Texas. She grew up in a house with no air conditioning, a father who worked the lumber mills, and a mother who made biscuits every morning before sunrise. Evelyn learned early that love was not a word. It was a verb. And you showed it in how you cooked, how you listened, how you made people feel when they walked through your door. And for 68 years, that is exactly what she did. She married young. Her husband, Robert Mercer, was a machinist at a local plant, a quiet man with steady hands and a dry sense of humor. They built a life on a modest street in a town where people knew each other's business and looked after each other's kids. Evelyn kept the house clean enough to eat off the floors. She trimmed her rose bushes with the same precision her husband used on engine parts. She went to First Baptist Church every Sunday without fail. She kept a glass bowl of peppermint candies on the entry table, and every child in the neighborhood knew it was there. When Robert passed away from a heart condition in 1992, Evelyn mourned him quietly and then kept living the way he would have wanted. She did not fall apart. She planted more roses. Her son Daniel was her pride. He joined the Army right out of high school and served in the Gulf War as a vehicle mechanic. He came home with a straight spine, a short temper, and a belief that discipline could fix anything. Evelyn never told him he was wrong, but she sometimes thought he confused control with connection. Daniel married a woman named Sharon, and together they had Tyler. But the marriage did not last. Sharon left when Tyler was 9. The divorce was messy. Tyler bounced between houses, between schools, between versions of himself. Daniel tried to hold things together with rules. Evelyn tried to hold things together with pot roast and patience. For a while, it almost worked. Tyler spent many weekends at Evelyn's house growing up. She kept a quilt on the guest bed that she had sewn herself, blue and white with a star pattern. Tyler slept under it every time he stayed over. She made him breakfast in the morning and let him watch cartoons while she did the crossword. When he got older, she drove him to school on days Daniel had early shifts. She packed his lunches. She wrote little notes and slipped them inside. Tyler rolled his eyes at the notes. He told his friends his grandma was annoying, but he never threw the notes away. Evelyn knew that. She found them once in his jacket pocket, folded small, tucked behind a gas station receipt. She smiled and never mentioned it. As Tyler entered his teenage years, the visits became harder. He was moodier, louder. He talked back more. He mocked her cooking. He complained about her television shows. He slammed doors when he didn't get his way. Evelyn handled it the way she handled everything, with calm, with firmness, with the quiet belief that the boy she loved was still in there somewhere under the noise. Her neighbors noticed the change in Tyler. One of them, a woman named Dolores, told Evelyn she didn't have to keep taking him in. Evelyn shook her head and said something Dolores would later repeat to every reporter who asked. She said, "He's moody, but he's still a good boy." Those words would haunt the trial like a ghost that refused to leave the room. In the days before the murder, Evelyn had discovered something that changed the dynamic. She found that Tyler had been stealing money from her purse, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Or she also found a bag he had packed and hidden in the guest room closet. It had clothes, a flashlight, snacks, and a hand-drawn map. He was planning to run away. Evelyn did not scream. She did not call Daniel immediately. She sat Tyler down at the kitchen table and told him calmly that they would discuss it when his father returned from his overnight work shift. She was not threatening him. She was trying to save him. But Tyler did not hear concern. He heard control. He heard exposure. He heard the end of the story he had been writing for himself in secret. That evening, Evelyn covered his dinner plate with foil and left it on the stove. She told Dolores over the phone that Tyler was quiet but seemed fine. She said she would talk to Daniel in the morning and sort everything out. She turned on the porch light like she always did. She locked the front door. She went to bed believing her home was safe. It was the last ordinary evening of her life. And somewhere in the guest room, under the blue and white quilt she had made with her own hands, Tyler was not sleeping. He was thinking. The porch light stayed on for a woman who would never walk out that front door again. The night was warm and still. No wind, no rain. Just the low hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog 2 houses down. Daniel was away on an overnight security job, a 12-hour shift that would keep him gone until morning. The house belonged to Evelyn and Tyler now. 2 people under one roof. One had faith. The other had fury. And the distance between them was measured not in rooms, but in everything Tyler had been carrying inside himself for years. He paced between the kitchen and the garage. He opened a bottle from the cabinet Daniel kept locked, but Tyler had figured out months ago. He drank fast, not to relax, to build something. Courage, numbness, permission. Evelyn came out of her room around 10. She was wearing a housecoat and slippers. She saw the bottle on the counter and told Tyler to put it away. He ignored her. She said it again. He told her to mind her own business. She did not raise her voice. She never did. She simply reminded him that in the morning they were going to have a conversation with his father about the money and the packed bag. She said it was not a punishment. It was a chance to start over. Tyler heard none of that. What he heard was a woman standing between him and the version of himself that he had been protecting for months. The version that answered to no one. The version that could disappear whenever it wanted. The argument grew slowly. He told her she had no right to go through his things. She told him she had every right because she loved him. He mocked her age. He called her old and useless. She stood her ground. She told him his father deserved the truth. And then something shifted, not in the room, in him. A wall came down inside Tyler Mercer that had been cracking for years, and behind it was not sadness, not fear, not confusion. Behind it was rage so entitled and so absolute that it did not even recognize the woman standing in front of it as someone who mattered. He left the kitchen. He walked to the hall closet, and he came back holding something that changed everything. It was Daniel's handgun, taken from a lockbox Tyler had learned to open weeks earlier. Evelyn saw it, and her face changed, not to fear right away, to disbelief. She said his name once, just once. Tyler, like she was calling him back from wherever he had gone. But he was already past the point where names meant anything. He raised the weapon. The sound that followed was the loudest thing that house had ever heard. One shot. Evelyn fell backward against the kitchen counter and slid to the floor. The clock on the wall kept ticking. The dog 2 houses down started barking louder. And Tyler stood there, breathing hard, staring at the woman who had made him breakfast that morning, now crumpled on the linoleum she had mopped the day before. But she was still alive, still conscious, still looking at him. And that is when the crime became something beyond a single terrible moment. Tyler panicked, not with guilt, with frustration. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen block. What happened next was not an act of survival. It was not self-defense. It was not even a crime of passion anymore. It was a sustained and deliberate assault on a 68-year-old woman who could not fight back. He struck again and again, concentrated on the upper body, force that went far beyond what was needed. Evelyn raised her hands to protect herself. She tried. Her body bore the proof of that effort, but she was outmatched in every way that mattered. The attack lasted minutes. It felt like hours, and when it finally stopped, it was not because mercy arrived. It was because exhaustion did. The house went silent. Tyler stood in the middle of the kitchen, covered in evidence he could not yet comprehend. In his right hand was bleeding from a deep cut where the knife had slipped during the attack. That wound would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But in that moment, Tyler did not think about forensics. He did not think about Evelyn. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror. He checked his face. He wrapped his hand in a kitchen towel. And then, with a calm that would later horrify every person who heard about it, he began to clean. He dragged Evelyn's body across the floor. He stripped the bedding. He opened drawers and scattered contents to make the house look like someone had broken in. He was 16 years old, standing in his grandmother's blood, and his first instinct was not to cry. It was to create a story that made him the victim. He moved her body through the back door and into the yard under cover of darkness. Near the fence line, where the soil was soft from weeks of watering the garden Evelyn had tended so carefully, he dug. The hole was shallow because he was drunk and tired and overconfident. He placed her body inside and covered it with dirt and a few pieces of scrap wood. He did not say a word. He did not pause. He went back inside. He washed his hands. He took the cash from Evelyn's purse. He grabbed 2 firearms from the gun cabinet. He picked up the car keys from the hook by the door. And before he walked out of that house for the last time, he pulled out his phone and sent a text message to a friend. The message read like any other bored teenager on a Friday night. Casual, light, empty. Inside the fresh-turned dirt in the backyard, now one of Evelyn's hands rested almost close enough to daylight. Tyler Mercer pulled out of his grandmother's driveway before 5 in the morning. The sky was still dark. The streetlights were still on. He was driving Evelyn's tan Buick, a car every neighbor on that block would recognize. He wore one of Daniel's jackets, too big in the shoulders, like a boy playing dress-up as a man. He had bandaged his right hand with gauze from the bathroom cabinet and pulled the sleeve down to cover it. In his mind, this was the clean break. The beginning of a new chapter. He would drive far enough that no one could find him, and by the time anyone asked questions, the story would already be written. A break-in, a missing woman, a grandson who was never there. He believed distance was the same thing as innocence. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of town at 5:12 in the morning. He filled the tank. He went inside and bought chips, a bottle of water, and a roll of medical tape. The cashier barely looked at him. Just another teenager buying snacks before a road trip. But above the register, mounted on a small metal bracket near the ceiling, a security camera recorded every second. It captured his face, his posture, the wrapped right hand, the jacket, the car, the timestamp. Tyler never looked up. He had no idea that this single stop, this ordinary transaction, would become the first piece of a trail that led straight back to a shallow grave in his grandmother's backyard. He thought the camera was part of the scenery. It was actually the first witness that could never be threatened or fooled. Back at the house, hours passed in silence. The porch light was still on. The front door was locked. The neighbor Dolores noticed that Evelyn's car was gone when she stepped outside to water her plants around 8. She thought maybe Evelyn had gone to the grocery store early. She thought nothing of it. By noon, she noticed the car was still gone, and the house was still dark. She knocked. No answer. She called Evelyn's phone. No answer. She told herself Evelyn might have gone to visit a friend. She told herself not to worry, but something in her chest told her to worry anyway. She called Daniel. He did not answer either. He was still finishing his overnight shift. It was not until late that afternoon that Daniel Mercer came home to a house that was not his mother's, but felt the absence of her the moment he walked through the door. Daniel stepped inside and felt it immediately. Not a sound, not a smell, a feeling. The kind soldiers learn to recognize. Something is wrong here. The drawers in the living room were pulled open. Clothes were scattered on the hallway floor. The gun cabinet was open, and 2 firearms were missing. A lamp was knocked over, but not broken in a way that made sense. The rug near the kitchen was shifted. The back door looked like it had been forced, but from the inside out. Daniel did not scream. He did not run. He pulled out his phone and called the police with a voice that was steady on the surface and splitting underneath. He said his mother was missing, his son was missing, and the house looked like it had been torn apart by someone who wanted it to look invaded but did not know how to do it right. Police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 patrol officers first, then a detective. They walked through the house taking notes and photographs. At first, the working theory was a possible abduction or domestic disturbance. Missing elderly woman, missing teenage grandson, signs of a break-in. But the detective, a man named Carl Rojas with 18 years on the job, did not buy the scene. The staging was wrong. Expensive items were untouched. A television, a radio, a jewelry box on the bedroom dresser, all still there. But personal areas were trashed, drawers emptied, papers thrown around. It looked like emotion, not theft. Someone had wanted the house to tell a story, and Detective Rojas had seen enough fake stories to know this one did not add up. Then the clues began stacking. A neighbor 2 doors down reported hearing something that sounded like a firecracker late the previous night. But another neighbor confirmed seeing a car pull out of the driveway before dawn. A muddy wheelbarrow near the back fence caught one officer's eye. It had been moved recently. The wheels had left tracks in the soft ground. And near the fence line, behind the rose bushes Evelyn had trimmed so carefully, the soil looked different. Darker, looser, freshly turned. The officer called Rojas over. Rojas crouched down and looked at the ground for a long time. Then he stood up and made a phone call. Within the hour, a forensic team was on its way. Daniel stood on the front lawn and watched his mother's house fill with strangers in gloves and uniforms. He wanted Tyler found alive. He wanted Evelyn found safe. But deep inside the part of him that had survived a war, a part that understood violence and its aftermath better than most, he was already doing the math. The missing guns, The missing car, the fake burglary, the empty house, and his son, who had been alone with his mother the night before, now gone without a word. Daniel did not say it out loud. He could not. But his body knew. His hands were shaking for the first time since combat. The excavation began within the hour. They did not have to dig long. Fabric appeared first, then skin. Then the impossible became official. Evelyn Mercer was buried in her own backyard. The grave was shallow, but the betrayal was bottomless. Within hours of finding Evelyn's body, everything changed. The missing person case became a homicide investigation. The missing grandson became the primary suspect. And the quiet Texas street where neighbors waved from their porches became a crime scene wrapped in yellow tape. A Detective Rojas issued a statewide alert. Vehicle description, license plate, photographs of Tyler Mercer. A warning that the suspect may be armed with at least 2 stolen firearms. The alert went out to every highway patrol unit, every border checkpoint, every sheriff's office from Texas to the Canadian line. Tyler had a head start of nearly 20 hours, but he was 16, alone, scared underneath the bravado, and running in a car that was already registered to a dead woman. The clock was ticking against him. Tyler drove north because north felt like a way. He had no real plan, no destination, no contacts waiting to take him in. He just drove. Through small towns and long stretches of highway where the only company was radio static and the sound of his own thoughts. He stopped for gas twice more. I'm paying with cash he had taken from Evelyn's purse. He bought fast food from drive-thrus and ate behind the wheel. He changed shirts once in a rest stop bathroom, stuffing the old one into a trash can. He thought he was erasing himself. He thought every mile he put between himself and that house made the story weaker. But he did not understand that every time he stopped, every time he swiped a bill across a counter, every time he pulled into a parking lot with cameras, he was writing the story louder. Investigators built the map of his escape from the evidence he left behind. Gas station receipts matched to surveillance footage. Toll cameras on the interstate, capturing the Buick's plates at predictable intervals. A convenience store in Oklahoma, where Tyler bought bandages and aspirin at 2 in the afternoon. His wrapped hand clearly visible on the security feed. An ATM camera in Kansas, where he tried to use one of Evelyn's bank cards and was declined. Each stop was a pin on the map. Each pin was a step closer. Tyler thought he was invisible. The system saw him everywhere. Every machine he used remembered him. Every transaction he made was a confession he did not know he was giving. Back in Texas, Daniel Mercer sat in a police station conference room watching footage of his own son driving his dead mother's car. Detective Rojas played the gas station clip first. Tyler walking in, browsing the aisle, paying with cash, walking out. Daniel recognized his son immediately. The posture, the way he held his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head when he looked at something on the shelf. Daniel said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded once and said, "That's him." No father should ever have to identify his child in a murder investigation. But Daniel Mercer was not just a father anymore. He was a witness, and his confirmation gave law enforcement everything they needed to turn the search into a pursuit. Tyler made it farther than anyone expected. He crossed through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and into the Dakotas over the span of 2 days. He slept in the car in short bursts, waking up disoriented and checking the mirrors. He listened to the radio but never heard his own name. That silence gave him confidence. He thought he had outrun the story. He thought the world had already moved on. He texted one friend from a rest stop phone charger, a vague message about being on a trip. He said nothing about Evelyn. He said nothing about blood. He talked about freedom like it was something he had earned rather than something he had stolen from a dead woman's pocket. The arrest came at a border crossing in North Dakota, near the Canadian line. Tyler pulled up to the checkpoint and handed over identification that did not match the vehicle registration. The border agent asked routine questions. Tyler answered badly. His voice was too fast. His story did not hold together. The agent noticed the bandaged hand and asked what happened. Tyler said he cut it cooking. The agent asked him to step out of the vehicle. A search revealed everything the state of Texas had been looking for. Cash, 2 stolen handguns, a blood-stained knife wrapped in a towel, clothing with trace evidence, and tucked in the center console, a small notepad with handwritten notes, Roots, Supplies, and a single line scrawled in teenage handwriting that read, "No one can stop me now." The border was supposed to be his escape. Instead, it became the wall where his story hit the truth and shattered. When they put the cuffs on him, Tyler Mercer did not ask about his grandmother. He did not ask about his father. He did not ask whether Evelyn had been found. The first words out of his mouth were about himself. He asked what charges he was facing. He asked if he could get a lawyer. He asked how long he would be held. The agents noted his calm, not the calm of innocence, the calm of someone who had already practiced this moment in his head and decided that self-preservation came before everything else. The handcuffs clicked shut. The bridge to Canada sat behind him, a few hundred yards of freedom he would never cross. And somewhere in Texas, Daniel Mercer received a phone call telling him his son was alive, in custody, and showing no signs of remorse. The bridge to escape had become the bridge where the story turned around. Back in Texas, the evidence was already telling Evelyn's story louder than any witness ever could. The forensic team had spent days inside the house, in the backyard and in the lab, collecting, cataloging, and processing every trace of what happened that night. Blood was the primary narrator. It was found on the kitchen floor, on the hallway wall, in the grooves of the tile, inside the bathroom drain, and soaked into the trunk lining of the Buick. Every sample was tested. Every result pointed in the same direction. Evelyn's DNA was on the knife. Tyler's blood was mixed into the scene from the cut on his right hand. The staging he had worked so hard to create began falling apart, not emotionally, but chemically. Science does not care about excuses. It reads what the blood already wrote. The medical examiner's report added a layer of horror that was difficult to hear in court, but impossible to ignore. Evelyn had sustained 1 gunshot wound and multiple stab wounds. The stab wounds were concentrated in the upper body and head. Several of them were inflicted after the initial injuries had already incapacitated her. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms showed that she had tried to protect herself. She fought back the only way she could, with bare hands against a knife. The time of death was consistent with the hours when Tyler was alone with her in the house. The report was clinical. The reality it described was savage. The autopsy did what families cannot bear to do. It translated suffering into numbers and measurements and medical terminology. And every measurement pointed to one person. Investigators also recovered a trail of digital evidence that Tyler never thought to fully erase. His phone records showed internet searches in the weeks before the murder, searches about running away, searches about how to clean certain stains, searches about what happens when someone goes missing and nobody reports it right away. He had also deleted several text messages in the hours after the killing, but forensic recovery tools brought most of them back. One message sent to a friend days before the murder hinted that he might have to do something crazy soon. At the time, it sounded like teenage drama. Under the weight of homicide, it sounded like premeditation. Tyler was not a criminal mastermind. He was a 16-year-old who thought deleting a text was the same as deleting the truth. The staging mistakes were even more damaging. Detective Rojas walked the jury through every inconsistency. The supposed forced entry at the back door showed damage from the inside out, not the outside in. Drawers were emptied of personal items, but valuable electronics and jewelry were untouched. No fingerprints from any unknown intruder were found anywhere in the house. The only fingerprints on the gun lockbox belonged to Tyler. Soil from the wheelbarrow matched soil found on Tyler's shoes recovered from the car in North Dakota. Laundry detergent traces on several towels suggested someone had attempted a hasty cleanup. But when investigators applied luminol to the kitchen floor, the chemical glow revealed what bleach and soap could not fully erase. The floor lit up in streaks and smears, footprints, drag marks, a path from the kitchen to the back door. The house itself became a witness that could not be cross-examined. The interrogation added another dimension. When Tyler was brought back to Texas and questioned by detectives, he cycled through multiple versions of events. First, he denied being in the house at all that night. When confronted with surveillance footage, he changed the story. He said intruders had come while he was asleep, and he panicked and ran. When asked why he took the guns and the knife, he said he grabbed them for protection. When asked about the buried body, he said he blacked out and did not remember. Each version contradicted the last. Each shift was documented. Yas detectives did not need a dramatic confession because the contradictions were already doing the work. His tone throughout was not fearful. It was annoyed, almost offended, as if the adults in the room were being unreasonable for not accepting whichever story he offered. That attitude would later become one of the prosecution's most powerful tools. Prosecutors began building their case around a simple but devastating framework. They argued there were not one, but three separate crimes embedded in this case: the killing itself, the burial and concealment, and the elaborate lie constructed to cover both. Each crime required separate decisions, separate actions, separate moments where Tyler could have stopped and chose not to. The defense would later argue youth, alcohol, and emotional instability. But the state's position was clear. This was not a single explosion of rage. This was a chain of calculated choices made by someone who understood consequences well enough to try to avoid them. That understanding, the prosecution argued, was the very definition of consciousness of guilt. The chapter in the forensic story that haunted the courtroom most came last. Under ultraviolet light, investigators revealed bloody shoe impressions pressed into the kitchen tile. The prints led from the spot where Evelyn fell to the back door where Tyler had dragged her body outside. He had tried to mop the floor afterward. He had tried to erase the path, but mopping only spread the evidence wider. The prints became lighter near the door, but never disappeared. They were his size, his shoe pattern, his path. The floor remembered where he walked, and no amount of soap, bleach, or teenage arrogance could make it forget. Understanding what Tyler Mercer did requires understanding who Tyler Mercer was before the blood, the blade, and the burial. He was not born a monster. No one is. He was born a boy in a military household where love was real but expressed through rules rather than words. His father, Daniel, showed affection the way the Army taught him, by providing structure, enforcing discipline, and expecting results. His mother, Sharon, showed affection by being present until she wasn't. When the divorce came, Tyler was 9, old enough to understand that his world was splitting in two, too young to know how to hold both halves. He began performing toughness for his father, performing helplessness for his mother, performing charm for anyone who could give him what he wanted. And somewhere in all that performance, the real Tyler Mercer got lost. Teachers described him as a boy who could be brilliant when he cared and invisible when he didn't. He turned assignments in late or not at all. He disrupted classrooms not with aggression, but with a kind of theatrical boredom designed to make adults feel foolish for trying. He was the kid who would crack a joke during a serious moment and then act wounded when he was reprimanded. His guidance counselor noted in a school file that Tyler had difficulty accepting responsibility and often reframed his own failures as someone else's fault. These are small flags in isolation. Every school has students like this. But in hindsight, they form a pattern of entitlement dressed as adolescence, a pattern of deflection mastered before the age of 15. His social life followed the same arc. Friends described him as fun but unpredictable. He could be generous one day and cruel the next. One former girlfriend told investigators that Tyler had a gift for making you feel like the most important person in the room and then suddenly treating you like you didn't exist. When confronted, he would flip the narrative. He would accuse the other person of being too sensitive or too dramatic. He never apologized without qualification, never admitted fault without redirecting blame. He was not physically violent before the murder, but he carried a kind of emotional volatility that made people cautious around him. They liked him in small doses. They learned to keep their distance when the mood turned. The psychological framework that best explains what happened that night is not madness. It is narcissistic injury. Tyler did not kill Evelyn because she threatened his body. He killed her because she threatened his story. The story he had been building for months, maybe years, was that he was smarter than every adult in his life, that he could steal without being caught, that he could lie without being questioned, that he could plan his escape and execute it on his own terms. When Evelyn found the packed bag and the stolen money and calmly told him they would discuss it with Daniel, she was not just imposing discipline. She was pulling back the curtain on the fantasy. She was forcing Tyler to see himself as he actually was. Not a mastermind, not an outlaw, just a troubled 16-year-old boy who had been outsmarted by a grandmother with reading glasses and a habit of checking jacket pockets. That exposure was intolerable to him, not because the consequences would be severe. Daniel would have been angry, yes. There would have been punishment. But Tyler had survived punishment before. What he could not survive, what his ego could not absorb, was the image of himself as ordinary, dependent, and caught. Evelyn's calm was worse than any screaming match. Her disappointment carried a weight that mockery never could. She still believed he could be better. And that belief, that stubborn maternal faith, was the most dangerous thing in the room, because it asked him to be something he had already decided he did not want to be: accountable, honest, a boy who still needed his grandmother. He chose to silence the ask rather than answer it. His behavior after the arrest reinforced the prosecution's profile. During transport back to Texas, Tyler complained about the handcuffs being too tight. He asked for different food. He asked when he could make a phone call. He did not ask about Evelyn once. During early court appearances, he scanned the room like an audience member, not a defendant. He whispered to his attorney during testimony and nearly smiled when he recognized a family member in the gallery. These moments were small, but to a jury watching for signs of humanity, they were earthquakes. They did not prove guilt by themselves, but they proved something the prosecution considered just as important. They proved the absence of the thing that should have been present: regret. The most revealing moment came from inside the detention facility. A guard later testified that during a break between legal meetings, Tyler was seen in the common area watching a television game show. He was laughing, not nervously, not inappropriately, just laughing at a joke on a screen while the family of the woman he killed was meeting with prosecutors in a building across the street to plan a funeral. It may have been innocent. Teenagers laugh. People cope in strange ways. But in the context of everything else, it became another piece of the mosaic the jury could not unsee. Outside, the family was choosing flowers for a casket. Inside, Tyler Mercer was acting like time still belonged to him. He thought he would never be fully known. The courtroom was about to prove him wrong. Before the trial could begin, the state of Texas had to answer a question that divided the entire community. Would Tyler Mercer be tried as a juvenile or as an adult? Under Texas law at the time, a juvenile as young as 14 could be certified for adult prosecution in capital cases if the court found sufficient grounds. The district attorney, a career prosecutor named Sandra Killian, argued forcefully for certification. She presented the aggravating factors one by one: the killing of a family member in her own home, the extreme level of violence, the use of multiple weapons, the deliberate concealment of the body, the staging of a false crime scene, the theft of firearms and a vehicle, the flight across multiple state lines, and the total absence of remorse at any stage. Killian told the court that these were not the actions of a confused child. These were the choices of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and made a calculated decision at every turn to protect himself. The certification hearing drew enormous attention. Local newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Television trucks lined the courthouse parking lot. The town was split. Some people stood outside the courthouse holding signs that said, "Justice has no age limit." Others held signs that said, "He is still a child." Inside the hearing room, the arguments were equally divided. The defense attorney, Harold Benson, presented evidence of Tyler's troubled childhood, the divorce, the instability, the emotional neglect that came not from cruelty, but from a father who never learned how to talk about feelings. Benson called adolescent development experts who testified that the teenage brain is not fully formed, particularly in the areas that govern impulse control, long-term thinking, and emotional regulation. He argued that trying Tyler as an adult, say especially for a capital offense, would be punishing a child for having a child's brain. The judge listened to both sides for 2 full days. In the end, he ruled that the case warranted adult certification. The nature of the crime, the level of planning after the killing, the sustained flight, the utter lack of cooperation. All of these factors, the judge said, indicated a defendant whose actions went far beyond the impulsive behavior associated with typical juvenile offenders. Tyler Mercer would face trial as an adult in a Texas courtroom with a full adult jury, and the state would be permitted to seek the maximum penalty the law allowed, including death. The ruling sent a shudder through the defense team. Benson had prepared for this possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud by a judge made it real in a way that paperwork never could. The prosecution's trial narrative was built on a single concept: sequence. Sandra Killian did not describe the murder as one terrible moment. She described it as a staircase. Step 1, the argument. Step 2, retrieving the gun. Step 3, firing the shot. Step 4, grabbing the knife. Step 5, the sustained attack. Step 6, cleaning the scene. Step 7, burying the body. Step 8, staging the break-in. Step 9, stealing the car and guns. Step 10, fleeing the state. Step 11, lying to everyone. Each step was a separate decision. Each decision was a moment when Tyler could have stopped, could have called for help, could have felt something. And each time, Killian told the jury, he chose himself. The staircase framework became the spine of the prosecution's case. It was simple, it was visual, and it was devastating. The courtroom atmosphere during the trial itself was unlike anything this county had seen. The gallery was packed every day. Family members on both sides sat in separate rows. Evelyn's church friends wore small ribbon pins. Daniel Mercer sat behind the prosecution table in the same dark suit every day, as if changing clothes would somehow acknowledge that life was continuing normally when it was not. Reporters filled the press section and spilled into the hallway. The judge imposed strict rules on behavior. No phones, no reactions, no speaking during testimony. The tension was so thick that even the bailiff seemed to hold his breath when witnesses took the stand. Daniel's position in the courtroom was the most painful in the room. He wanted accountability. He wanted the truth about what happened to his mother to be spoken out loud in a place that mattered. But he also could not escape the fact that the person the state was trying to convict and possibly execute was his own child, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, the boy he had taken fishing on summer mornings, the boy whose childhood photographs were now being passed around as trial exhibits. Daniel held himself together with the same discipline that had carried him through war. But some mornings, when the courtroom was still empty and the chairs were still cold, he sat alone and stared at the wall. He was a son who had lost his mother. He was a father who was losing his son. There is no training for that. The prosecution made its final pretrial announcement with the courtroom full and the cameras rolling. Sandra Killian stood before the bench and formally declared that the state of Texas would seek the death penalty against Tyler Mercer. The room did not erupt. It froze. Tyler's face tightened for the first time since his arrest. Not grief, not understanding. Just the first visible crack in the armor he had been wearing since the moment he was caught. The defense objected. The judge noted the objection. The trial moved forward. But the air in the room had changed. It was no longer just about what Tyler had done. It was about whether the state would take his life in return. The room had been talking about guilt. Now it was talking about ending his life. The trial began on a Tuesday. The sky outside was gray and heavy, like the weather itself understood what was happening inside. Tyler Mercer was brought in through the side entrance. She'd dressed this time in a white shirt and dark slacks chosen by his defense team to make him look younger, more vulnerable, more like a boy, and less like a defendant. It worked for about 30 seconds. Until he sat down at the defense table and leaned back in his chair like he was waiting for a movie to start. He crossed one ankle over the other. He whispered something to his attorney and almost smirked. A deputy standing nearby shifted his weight and moved one step closer. The jury had not even been seated yet, and the performance had already begun. Opening statements set the emotional battlefield. Sandra Killian walked to the center of the courtroom and spoke without notes. She told the jury about a 68-year-old woman who opened her door to her grandson because love told her to. She told them about a teenager who repaid that love with a weapon. She told them about a shallow grave behind rose bushes that had been watered by the same hands that were buried beneath them. Her voice never rose above a conversational tone. It did not need to. The facts were loud enough. When she finished, the courtroom was so still that the creak of a wooden bench sounded like a gunshot. She sat down. The jury stared at Tyler. He did not look back. Harold Benson's opening was different in tone but equally deliberate. He asked the jury not to decide this case in the first hour. He told them they would hear about a broken home, a boy who drank to numb feelings he couldn't name, a teenager whose brain science said was physically incapable of adult-level decision-making. He did not deny the killing. He could not. The evidence was overwhelming. What he denied was the meaning the prosecution was trying to attach to it. This was not calculated evil, he said. This was a catastrophic juvenile breakdown, amplified by alcohol and years of emotional damage. He asked the jury to hold their judgment until they had heard everything. Some of them nodded. Others stared past him at the boy who was still leaning back in his chair. The first days of testimony belonged to the prosecution. Witnesses took the stand, one after another. The neighbor who heard the sound at night. The gas station clerk who sold Tyler bandages and chips before dawn. The border agent who found the guns and the knife in the car. Detective Rojas, who walked the jury through the crime scene with photographs and diagrams that made several jurors look away. Each witness added a brick to the wall. Each piece of evidence confirmed what the prosecution had promised. This was not a single moment of chaos. This was a chain of deliberate actions stretching from a kitchen in Texas to a bridge in North Dakota. And at every link in that chain, Tyler Mercer had chosen to keep going. Tyler's behavior during testimony became a separate story within the trial. He fidgeted. He whispered. He chewed the inside of his cheek. When a procedural issue delayed a witness, he tilted his head back and exhaled loudly enough for the first two rows to hear. The judge stopped the proceedings and looked directly at the defense table. He told counsel that any further disruptions from the defendant would be addressed immediately and firmly. Tyler straightened. The room tightened. It was the kind of authority beat that true crime audiences live for. Someone powerful had finally noticed the behavior that had been crawling under everyone's skin. But the swagger did not disappear entirely. It just retreated to the edges of his face, waiting. The emotional peak of this phase came when Daniel Mercer took the stand. He was called by the prosecution to testify about the firearms, the house layout, and the timeline. But his testimony went further than logistics. When asked to describe his mother, Daniel paused for 3 full seconds. Then he spoke about her church attendance, her garden, her habit of calling him every Sunday to ask if he was eating properly, her refusal to give up on Tyler even when Daniel himself had run out of patience. When the prosecutor asked whether Tyler loved Evelyn, Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She loved him enough for both of them." The courtroom went still. A juror wiped her eye. Tyler looked at the table. Whether it was shame, discomfort, or performance, no one in that room could say for certain. But for the first time, the bravado dimmed. The judge addressed Tyler directly at the end of the session. He reminded him that the courtroom was not a stage, and that the gravity of the charges demanded a level of respect that had not yet been shown. Tyler's attorney placed a hand on his arm. Tyler looked up at the judge and for the first time did not smirk, did not lean back, did not look away with disinterest. He sat up straight and nodded once. It was small, it was late, and it was not enough to erase what the jury had already seen. For the first time, the smirk needed work. And work was not something Tyler Mercer had ever been good at. The prosecution's case was built on evidence, but the emotional center of the trial arrived with the victim impact testimony. This was the part of the proceedings where the courtroom stopped being a machine and became a memorial. One by one, the people who loved Evelyn Mercer stood before the jury and tried to put into words what had been taken from them. Not just a life, a presence, a voice, a pair of hands that had held theirs through every hard thing the world had ever thrown at their family. And as each person spoke, the distance between the legal concept of murder and the human reality of loss collapsed completely. Evelyn's younger sister, Margaret, was the first to testify. She was 71 years old, thin, with hands that shook slightly as she held a folded piece of paper. She told the court about growing up with Evelyn, about sharing a bedroom and whispering secrets after their parents turned the lights off, about Evelyn teaching her to sew, about the phone calls that came every Wednesday evening for 40 years without fail. And then she said the thing that broke the room open. She said that the hardest part was not knowing Evelyn was gone. The hardest part was knowing how she was gone, knowing that her last minutes were spent in fear and pain inside the house she had built with love. Margaret's voice cracked on the word love. She folded her paper. She sat down. The courtroom did not recover for a long time. A woman from Evelyn's church named Patricia spoke next. She described the peppermint bowl by the door and how Evelyn always kept it full because she said you never know who might need something sweet on a hard day. She described how Evelyn volunteered to deliver meals to homebound members of the congregation every Thursday. She described the last conversation they had 2 days before the murder, when Evelyn told her she was worried about Tyler but believed things would work out. Patricia repeated those words slowly. She believed things would work out. Then she looked at the defense table and said nothing more. The silence said everything. Daniel Mercer was called again during this phase, not as a fact witness, but as a family member. His testimony this time was not about guns and timelines. It was about a mother. He told the court that Evelyn had kept every birthday card he ever gave her in a kitchen drawer, tied with a rubber band. He said she called him her soldier even after he retired. He said that when he told her he was sending Tyler for the weekend, she had not hesitated. She had said, "Send him over, I'll make his favorite." Daniel stopped speaking after that sentence. He pressed his lips together, his jaw locked, his knuckles went white on the witness stand rail. He was not performing grief. He was containing it, and the containment was more devastating than any outburst could have been. The defense used the family pain to make a different argument. Benson approached the bench and suggested carefully that Evelyn Mercer was a woman of profound mercy, that her life was defined by forgiveness and patience, that if she could speak, and she would not want her grandson to face death at the hands of the state. It was a bold argument, and it landed with a kind of uncomfortable grace. Some in the gallery nodded, others looked furious. The prosecution responded with a line that would echo through the rest of the trial. Sandra Killian stood and said, "Mercy for the defendant cannot erase the mercy that was denied to the victim in her final minutes." The collision between those two versions of justice, one rooted in love and the other in accountability, became the moral heart of the case. Tyler sat through the impact testimony with his head slightly bowed. Whether from instruction, exhaustion, or the weight of what he was hearing, he showed less of the bravado that had defined his earlier appearances. His face was still. His hands were flat on the table. He did not cry. And he did not look at the witnesses. He did not react when Margaret described their childhood. He did not flinch when Daniel said Evelyn called him her soldier. To the jury, this registered not as calm, but as absence. The thing that should have been present, grief, recognition, horror at what he had done, was simply not there. And for a jury weighing punishment, that absence spoke as loudly as any confession. After the session ended, Daniel walked into the hallway alone. He stood near a window where the late afternoon light came through in long bars. A reporter approached him, and he shook his head. A family member tried to touch his arm, and he pulled away gently, not in anger, but in the need to hold himself together just a few minutes longer. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed Evelyn and her late husband Robert standing side by side in front of their house the year it was built. She was smiling. Robert had his arm around her waist. Daniel looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it once and put it back. The family had come to the courthouse for answers. They left carrying pieces. Every trial has a moment where the defense must stand between the accused and the full weight of the state and argue that the worst thing a person has ever done should not be the only thing that defines them. For Harold Benson, this was that moment. He did not deny the killing. The evidence was too overwhelming, too forensic, too documented for denial. Instead, he built his case around a different question. Not what Tyler did, but why he did it, and whether a 16-year-old boy from a fractured home, drinking in a dark house, spiraling under pressure he could not articulate, deserved the most permanent punishment the law could impose. It was not a popular argument, but it was a necessary one, and Benson delivered it with the steady conviction of a man who believed the law must be better than the crime it judges. The defense called Dr. Helen Yates, an adolescent psychologist with 20 years of experience. She testified about the developing brain of a teenager. She explained that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and moral reasoning, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. In a 16-year-old, that part of the brain is still under construction. Decisions are driven more by emotion, more by the amygdala, are more by fear and anger and the desperate need for immediate relief. She did not say this excused the murder. She said it provided context. That a 16-year-old who makes a catastrophic choice under the influence of alcohol and years of emotional instability is not processing the world the same way an adult would. The jury listened. Some took notes. Others looked unconvinced. Benson then painted a picture of Tyler's home life that was painful for everyone in the room, especially Daniel. The divorce when Tyler was 9. The custody battles. The constant shuttling between two homes that operated on different emotional frequencies. Daniel's house was built on rules and silence. Sharon's house, before she drifted away entirely, was built on chaos and absence. Tyler existed in the gap between them, learning to perform whatever version of himself each environment required. He became a shapeshifter, A boy who told his father what authority wanted to hear, and told his mother what sympathy wanted to hear, and told himself a story that grew more dangerous every year. The defense argued this was not an excuse, it was an explanation, and an explanation matters when the state is asking a jury to end a life. The most uncomfortable testimony came when the defense addressed Daniel directly. An expert witness suggested that Daniel's military rigidity, while well-intentioned, had created an environment where vulnerability was treated as weakness, and emotional expression was met with correction rather than curiosity. Tyler grew up in a home where the answer to pain was discipline, where the response to confusion was structure, where love existed but was never spoken in a language the boy could hear. Daniel sat through this testimony like a man absorbing shrapnel. Some of it felt unfair. Some of it, in the quiet places he never showed anyone, felt partially true. He had never hit his son. He had never denied him anything material. But he had spent years trying to build a soldier out of a boy who needed a conversation. That failure did not make Daniel guilty, but it made the story more complicated than anyone wanted it to be. The prosecution cross-examined every defense witness with the same relentless focus. Sandra Killian did not argue with the brain science. She did not mock the psychology. She simply asked a series of practical questions that cut through abstraction like a blade through fog. If Tyler was too immature to control his impulses, how did he have the presence of mind to bury the body? If alcohol clouded his judgment, how did he stage a fake burglary? If emotional instability drove the violence, what drove the 2-day drive to the Canadian border with stolen guns and a bloody knife? Each question was a surgical strike. The defense could complicate the motive, it could humanize the boy, but it could not neutralize the chain of deliberate choices that followed the killing. And it was that chain, not the killing itself, that made the case feel like something more than a juvenile breakdown. The defense's strongest moment came at the end. Benson stood before the jury and made a plea rooted not in the past, but in the future. He said that at 16, Tyler Mercer's character was not fixed, that the human brain, the human soul, if you believed in such things, I was still capable of change at that age, that if the law gave him life instead of death, there was a chance, however slim, however uncertain, that time and maturity and intervention could reveal a person inside the wreckage worth saving. He asked the jury to believe in something they could not yet see. It was a powerful moment, and it lingered in the room long enough to create real tension. The audience did not need to agree, but they needed to feel the weight of the choice. Then the state played its final card of the day, a recorded phone call from Tyler in detention. The call was to a friend. In it, Tyler talked about his situation, but he did not talk about Evelyn. He did not talk about what he had done. He talked about himself, about dying in prison, about how unfair everything was, about how he didn't deserve this. The call was not a confession, but it confirmed the prosecution's theory more effectively than any expert testimony ever could. Tyler Mercer's primary concern, even facing the possibility of death, was Tyler Mercer. The defense's humane framing began slipping. Saving him was no longer simple mercy. Condemning him was no longer simple certainty. The courtroom sat between two truths, and neither one offered comfort. The final phase of the prosecution's case moved with the precision of a closing fist. Sandra Killian had spent weeks building the foundation. Now she assembled every piece into a single devastating sequence that left no room for doubt, no space for alternative theories, and no shelter for the boy sitting at the defense table. She called it the Reconstruction. And she delivered it to the jury not as a summary, but as a story told through objects, images, and irrefutable science. Each exhibit was placed before the jury in chronological order. Each one told a part of the night that Tyler Mercer tried to erase. And each one proved that erasure is impossible when the truth has already been written in blood and soil and digital timestamps. She began with the argument. Testimony from neighbors placed the timeline. A loud voice heard through the walls around 10 at night. Then a sound like a firecracker. Then silence. She moved to the weapon. The handgun recovered from the car matched the bullet recovered from the autopsy. Ballistic analysis confirmed it. The knife recovered from the car carried Evelyn's DNA on the blade and Tyler's blood on the handle. The medical examiner's report confirmed one gunshot wound followed by multiple stab wounds, defensive injuries on Evelyn's hands, concentrated trauma to the upper body. Force consistent with sustained aggression, not a single panicked moment. The clinical language made it worse. Every measurement, every angle, every notation in the pathologist's report was a sentence that Tyler could never talk his way out of. Then came the physical evidence from the house. Luminol imaging showed blood on the kitchen floor that had been mopped but not eliminated. Drag marks leading to the back door. Footprints in Tyler's shoe size pressed into the tile. Soil from the backyard matched samples taken from the wheelbarrow and from shoes recovered in the Buick's trunk. The staged burglary was dismantled point by point. No unknown fingerprints. No signs of external forced entry. Valuable items untouched. Personal areas ransacked. Detective Rojas testified that in 18 years of homicide work, he had never seen a staged scene this transparent. The house was not hiding Tyler's story. It was telling the truth he tried to bury along with his grandmother. The digital evidence completed the timeline with mechanical certainty. Gas station surveillance from 5:12 in the morning. Toll camera images from 3 states. Convenience store footage from Oklahoma. An ATM attempt in Kansas. Each image showed Tyler driving north, bandaged hand visible, expression calm, posture unremarkable. A teenager on a road trip. Except every mile was measured from a shallow grave. Phone records showed the text to a friend sent hours after the killing. Casual. Bored. Normal. Our deleted messages recovered by forensic software revealed earlier conversations hinting at running away and doing something drastic. Internet search history showed queries about cleaning blood, avoiding detection, and crossing state borders. Tyler had not planned the murder in advance, but he had fantasized about escape long before the night arrived. The outline of flight was drawn before the trigger was pulled. Killian brought the evidence together with the line that would define the trial. She stood before the jury and said, "This was not one bad decision. This was a staircase." She held up her hand and counted. The argument, the gun, the shot, the knife, the attack, the cleanup, the burial, the staging, the theft, the flight, the lies. 11 steps. 11 separate moments where a human being could have stopped. It could have called for help, could have fallen to the floor and wept and dialed 911 and said, "I have done something terrible." Tyler Mercer did not take a single one of those exits. He walked past every one of them and kept climbing. That image, a staircase built from choices, became the emotional thesis of the prosecution's case. It answered the defense's collapse narrative with something far more damning. Not impulse. Deliberation unfolding in stages. The jury also saw the injury evidence. Tyler's cut hand, documented in photographs taken at the time of arrest, was consistent with a self-inflicted wound caused by the knife slipping during a sustained stabbing motion. The prosecution's medical expert confirmed that the angle, depth, and location of the wound aligned precisely with the kind of injury seen when a blade turns against the user during forceful downward strikes. This was not a scratch from a kitchen accident. It was a mark left by the murder itself, pressed into Tyler's body at the same moment he was pressing violence into Evelyn's. His own flesh bore witness against him. The murder had branded him before the law ever could. The final exhibit was the most quietly devastating. Killian displayed a photograph of Evelyn's kitchen table. On it sat a plate covered in foil. The dinner Evelyn had prepared for Tyler the evening before the murder. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, covered and waiting for a grandson she believed was still worth feeding. That plate was never touched. It sat on the table through the murder, through the cleanup, through the burial, through the staging. Tyler walked past it on his way out the door. He took the cash. He took the guns. He took the car. He left the dinner. The plate became the prosecution's closing image. While Evelyn lay buried behind the house, the dinner she made with love sat cold and untouched in the kitchen. The farther he ran, the more the truth caught up. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the walls were holding their breath. Closing arguments were over. The judge had delivered his instructions. The jury stood as one and filed out through the side door into the deliberation room. 12 people carrying the weight of everything they had seen and heard over the past weeks. Crime scene photographs, autopsy diagrams, surveillance footage, the sound of Daniel Mercer's voice breaking over the word soldier. In the sight of Tyler Mercer leaning back in his chair like the world owed him patience. The plate of pot roast covered in foil. All of it now lived inside those 12 minds, and no one in the courtroom could reach them. The door closed. The waiting began. Tyler sat at the defense table with his hands flat in front of him. For the first time in the entire trial, he was not leaning back. He was not whispering. He was not scanning the room. He was still. His fingers flexed once against the edge of the table and then stopped. Harold Benson sat beside him with a legal pad covered in notes he would never read again. Across the aisle, Sandra Killian organized her files with the calm efficiency of someone who had done everything she could and now had to trust the process. The gallery was full, but motionless. And family members sat in their rows like passengers waiting for a verdict they had already imagined 100 times in 100 different ways. Some prayed. Some stared at the floor. Some held hands so tight their knuckles disappeared. Daniel Mercer sat alone during part of the recess. Not with the prosecution team, not with extended family. Alone on a bench in the hallway where the afternoon light came through a high window and made a pale rectangle on the floor. He had spent weeks in this building watching strangers describe the worst thing his family had ever produced. He had heard his mother reduced to an evidence number and his son reduced to a case file. He had answered questions that no father should ever have to answer and sat through testimony that no son should ever have to hear. Now he waited in the in-between space where neither grief nor justice had fully arrived. He was not in any camp that offered comfort. He was in the camp of a man who had lost everything to the same event and could not even mourn one loss without confronting the other. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. During that time, they requested to review several exhibits: the surveillance footage from the gas station, the autopsy photographs, the recorded phone call from detention, and the photograph of the dinner plate. Each request sent a ripple of speculation through the courthouse hallways. What were they focusing on? Were they stuck? Were they divided? No one could say. The judge instructed everyone to remain patient. Reporters rehearsed phrases in their notebooks. Rare juvenile capital verdict. Historic sentencing. Some paced. Others sat and watched the clock like it might offer answers the jury had not yet delivered. The jury returned on the second afternoon. The foreman handed a folded piece of paper to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. The judge opened it, read it without expression, and handed it to the clerk. The clerk stood. The courtroom rose. Tyler was brought to his feet by his attorney's hand on his elbow. The clerk read the verdict in a voice that carried no emotion because the words carried enough on their own. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tyler Daniel Mercer, guilty of capital murder. Guilty? The word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. It did not splash. It sank. One of Evelyn's relatives sobbed once and then pressed a hand over her mouth. Another family member exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for months. Tyler lowered his eyes. Not in shame, in something closer to recognition. The first half of justice had arrived. The trial then moved into the punishment phase, and the air in the room changed again. This was no longer about what happened. It was about what would happen next. The jury heard final arguments about future dangerousness, about the nature of the crime, about the possibility of rehabilitation, about the value of a life that had not yet been fully lived. Sandra Killian argued that the chain of choices after the killing demonstrated a level of deliberation and self-interest that went beyond adolescent impulsivity. Harold Benson argued that executing a 16-year-old, no matter the crime, I would make the state a mirror of the violence it claimed to condemn. Both arguments were delivered with conviction. Both were heard. And both left the jury facing a decision that no amount of legal instruction could make feel clean. If you were sitting in that jury box, could you sentence a 16-year-old to the most permanent punishment the law allows for what he did to the woman who raised him? That question hung in the courtroom like smoke. There was no easy answer. There was no comfortable position. There was only the law, the evidence, the grief, and 12 people who had to decide what justice looked like when every possible outcome still left someone destroyed. The jury filed out again. The envelope was sealed. The punishment verdict waited inside a folded piece of paper that might contain a teenager's death sentence. As the courtroom had gone so quiet, it sounded like consequence. The jury returned for the final time on a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside had cleared after 2 days of overcast gray, and sunlight came through the courtroom windows at a low angle that made everything feel sharper. Every face, every edge, every breath. The gallery was at full capacity. Reporters had their pens ready. Family members sat rigid in their seats. The judge took the bench with the weight of a man who had presided over difficult cases before, but understood that this one would follow him for the rest of his career. He asked the foreman to stand. He asked whether the jury had reached a unanimous verdict on punishment. The foreman said yes. The bailiff carried the paper. The judge read it in silence. Then he passed it to the clerk. The clerk stood and read the jury's recommendation. Death. The word entered the room like a door closing at the end of a long hallway. It did not echo. It sealed. Tyler Mercer did not react immediately. His face held still for 2, 3, 4 seconds. Long enough for everyone watching to wonder if he had heard it. Then the reaction arrived, not as a scream or a sob, but as a slow physical collapse of the posture he had maintained for weeks. His lips parted. His shoulders locked forward. His eyes went unfocused, staring at a point on the table that meant nothing. The expression he had worn at arraignment, the lean, the smirk, the practiced boredom, was gone. Not reduced, not softened. Gone. What replaced it was something the courtroom had never seen on his face before. The raw, unguarded look of a boy who had finally understood that the story he thought he was writing had been rewritten by 12 strangers who did not believe he deserved to keep living it. The judge addressed the courtroom with the gravity the moment demanded. He spoke slowly. He spoke about the victim. He spoke about Evelyn Mercer's 68 years of life, her service to her church, her devotion to her family, her decision to open her home to a grandson she loved despite every warning sign. He spoke about the violation of that trust, not in abstract legal terms, but in human ones. He said that the court recognized Tyler Mercer's age. He said the court had considered every mitigating factor the defense presented. But he said that the court also had to reckon with the nature of the crime. A sustained and brutal attack followed by concealment, staging, theft, flight, and repeated deception. He said this was not the product of a single moment. It was the product of a staircase of choices. And at the top of that staircase, a grandmother lay buried behind her own home by the hands of the boy she trusted most. Daniel Mercer's reaction was the most difficult thing in that room to watch. He did not celebrate. He did not weep openly. He did not pound the bench or shake his head. He looked at his son. Then he looked at the judge. Then he looked down at his own hands, resting flat on his knees. The same hands that had once buckled Tyler into a car seat. The same hands that had taught him to throw a ball. The same hands that had identified him in surveillance footage. The state had given its answer. The jury had spoken. The judge had confirmed. And Daniel Mercer sat in the aftermath of all of it, a veteran who had survived a war only to lose his mother and his son in the same act of violence. There was no victory in his eyes. There was only the long, terrible stillness of a man who had been asked to endure the unendurable and had no choice but to keep breathing through it. The defense moved immediately to preserve appellate issues. Harold Benson stood and noted for the record every constitutional objection he had raised throughout the trial. He cited Tyler's age. He cited evolving standards of decency. He cited the ongoing national debate about juvenile capital punishment. He told the court that this verdict, while legally rendered, existed on constitutional ground that was shifting beneath the nation's feet. He was right. Within a year, the United States Supreme Court would take up the very question this trial had answered. But in this courtroom, on this day, the law as it stood had spoken. The death penalty for a 16-year-old offender was legal in the state of Texas in 2004. And Tyler Mercer had just become one of the youngest people in the state's modern history to receive that sentence. Tyler was offered the opportunity to make a statement before the court. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered. Tyler sat still for a moment. Then he spoke. His voice was quieter than anyone expected. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't mean for things to go this far. He did not say Evelyn's name. He did not look at her family. He did not describe what he had done or explain why. The apology was thin and self-protective. The kind of statement that sounds like remorse from a distance, but dissolves under any scrutiny. It satisfied no one. The family wanted more. The jury had already decided. The judge had already confirmed. Tyler's words floated in the courtroom for a moment and then disappeared, too small to fill the space that Evelyn's absence had created. The gavel came down. The sentence was entered into the record. Tyler Mercer was remanded to custody for transport to death row. Deputies moved to his sides. He stood slowly, like a boy waking from a dream he had believed he controlled. The chains clinked at his wrists and ankles. He was led through the side door, the same door he had entered through weeks earlier, with a smirk and a slouch, and the unshakable belief that his age, his attitude, and his story would carry him through. On the door closed behind him, the courtroom exhaled. The smirk had disappeared before the gavel fell, but the gavel made sure it never came back. The courtroom emptied slowly, not in a rush, not in celebration. People stood up one at a time, like survivors assessing the ground after something massive had passed through. Reporters moved toward the hallway to file their stories. Attorneys gathered their papers with the mechanical focus of people who had been running on adrenaline for weeks and were only now beginning to feel the weight. The jury was dismissed with the judge's thanks. They walked out without speaking to the press. Some of them looked relieved. Others looked hollowed. They had just sentenced a 16-year-old boy to the most permanent punishment their state could deliver, and no amount of legal reasoning could make that decision feel simple. Justice had arrived, but it did not arrive clean. It arrived covered in the fingerprints of everyone it had touched. Outside the courthouse, the town tried to absorb what had happened. Some people gathered in small groups on the sidewalk and spoke in low voices. Others went home and turned on the news and watched the story they had lived through reduced to a 30-second segment with a photograph of Tyler Mercer and a headline that fit on a single line. For weeks, this case had been the only thing anyone talked about in grocery store lines and church lobbies and school parking lots. Now it was over, and the silence it left behind was louder than the trial had ever been. The community was not divided into those who thought justice was served and those who didn't. It was divided into those who were certain and those who could not stop wondering whether certainty was enough. Evelyn Mercer's funeral had been held weeks earlier, before the trial even began. A small service at First Baptist Church. white flowers, her favorite hymn. A closed casket because the family could not bear what the open one would have required them to see. Margaret, her sister, read a passage from Scripture and then spoke about Evelyn's rose bushes and how she always said that anything worth growing required patience. Dolores, the neighbor who had heard the words, "He is still a good boy," sat in the back pew and cried quietly into a handkerchief. The peppermint bowl from the entry table had been emptied and placed on the kitchen counter by a relative who did not know what else to do with it. The house on the neat street was already becoming something else. Not a home, a memory that nobody wanted to enter, but nobody could bring themselves to sell. In the weeks following the sentencing, legal experts across the state and the nation weighed in on the case. Some praised the verdict as a just response to an unspeakable crime. Others condemned it as a moral failure, arguing that no civilized society should execute a person for something they did at 16, regardless of how terrible the act. The debate was not new. It had been building for years across courtrooms and legislatures and law review articles. But the Mercer case gave it a face. A baby-faced defendant who smirked in court, a grandmother who believed love could fix anything, a veteran father caught between grief and horror. The case became a reference point in conversations about juvenile justice that would intensify over the next year and eventually reach the highest court in the land. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court decided Roper v. Simmons. In that ruling, the court held that executing individuals for crimes committed before the age of 18 violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The decision effectively ended the juvenile death penalty in the United States. Cases like Tyler Mercer's, cases where a teenager was sentenced to die under laws that existed before Roper, were swept into a new legal reality. The ruling did not say that what Tyler did was forgivable. It did not say that his crime was less horrifying because of his age. It said that the law, at its best, must account for what science and conscience both recognize, that a developing mind, no matter how damaged, no matter how dangerous, is not the same as a finished one. The case sat inside a turning point in American legal history, and whether one agreed with the outcome or not, its place in that history was undeniable. Daniel Mercer did not speak publicly after the trial. He did not give interviews. He did not write a book. He did not appear on television to debate juvenile justice or capital punishment. He returned to his routines. He went back to work. He drove to the cemetery on Saturdays to visit his mother's grave. He stood in dress shoes that sank slightly into wet grass and said nothing, because nothing he could say would change what had happened. He had lost his mother to his son. He had lost his son to the state. And both of those losses lived inside the same moment, the same night, the same house. He carried them the way he had carried everything since the army, quietly, rigidly, alone. The parade ground spine never bent, but anyone who looked closely could see that it was holding up a different kind of weight now. Not duty, not discipline. Just the unrelenting sadness of a man who had done everything he knew how to do and watched it all fall apart anyway. The last image belongs to Evelyn, not to the courtroom, not to the gavel, not to Tyler's face when the word death entered the room. To Evelyn, standing in her garden on a Saturday morning, bending slightly to trim a rose bush that had grown exactly the way she wanted it to. Sunlight on her shoulders, dirt under her fingernails, the porch light behind her always on, just because she believed someone might need it. She was not a case number. She was not a headline. She was not Evidence Exhibit 14 or Autopsy Report 7. She was a woman who loved fiercely and trusted deeply and opened her door one last time to someone who did not deserve to walk through it. Her story does not end with the crime. It ends with the memory of who she was before the crime tried to define her. If you think justice was served, make sure others see this story too. Share this video. Leave a comment. Tell us what you would have done if you were in that courtroom. And remember Evelyn Mercer, not for how she died, for how she lived. He thought he would never be caught. He thought distance and lies and a teenager's arrogance were stronger than the truth. In the end, it was not the border, the blood, or even the jury that truly stopped him. It was the moment the court gave Evelyn Mercer back her voice. In the months following the sentencing, questions began to surface that the trial had not fully answered. Not about the evidence. The evidence was airtight. Not about the verdict. The verdict was legally sound. The questions were about the system, the institutions that had been close enough to Tyler Mercer to see the warning signs and had let every single one of them pass through without action. Teachers who noticed but never escalated. Counselors who documented but never intervened. Neighbors who sensed something wrong but trusted the family to handle it. A juvenile system that had processed minor theft reports and behavioral complaints and returned Tyler to the same environment each time with nothing more than a warning and a handshake. The question was not whether Tyler Mercer was guilty. The question was whether the system had failed long before the night he pulled the trigger. The school records painted a timeline that was painful in hindsight. At 13, Tyler had been flagged for emotional outbursts in class. At 14, a teacher reported that he had threatened a classmate during a dispute over something trivial. At 15, his guidance counselor wrote a note in his file that read, "Student shows escalating disregard for consequences and limited empathy in peer interactions. Recommend evaluation." The recommendation was never followed up. Not because anyone was negligent in the dramatic sense of the word, but because the system was overloaded. There were too many students, too few resources, and too many files that looked exactly like Tyler's. He was not unique in the data. He was one of hundreds of teenagers displaying concerning behavior in a district that did not have the capacity to act on every concern. That institutional blindness did not cause the murder, but it removed a barrier that might have changed the trajectory. The juvenile justice system had its own record. Tyler had been referred twice for minor theft, once at 14 and once at 15. Both times the cases were handled informally. Community service, a stern conversation, a letter to his father, no formal charges, no mandatory counseling, no follow-up evaluation. The system treated each incident as isolated because the system was designed to process incidents, not patterns. Nobody connected the dots because nobody was assigned to connect them. Tyler moved through the juvenile system the way water moves through a sieve. He passed through and nothing stuck. By the time his behavior escalated beyond property crime and into violence, there was no institutional memory to flag the urgency. He arrived at his grandmother's house that weekend as a boy with a documented history of escalation and zero active interventions. The system had seen him. It had just never truly looked at him. Daniel Mercer bore some of the institutional blame, and he knew it. Not because he was a bad father. He was not. But because his approach to Tyler's behavior was rooted in the same philosophy the system used. Treat each incident separately. Apply consequences. Move forward. Daniel believed in structure the way a mechanic believes in torque specifications. If you apply the right amount of pressure in the right direction, the bolt holds. But children are not bolts. And the pressure Daniel applied, the groundings, the confiscated privileges, the stern lectures delivered in a voice trained by drill sergeants did not hold Tyler together. It pushed the broken pieces further apart. Daniel saw this only in retrospect, and seeing it did not make it easier. It made it worse, because hindsight turned every parenting decision into a question he could never stop asking. What if I had listened instead of lectured? What if I had asked instead of ordered? What if I had sent him to a therapist instead of sending him to his grandmother? And the failure was not any one person's. It was collective, a school that flagged but did not act, a juvenile system that processed but did not connect, a father who disciplined but did not communicate, a mother who left and never came back, a neighborhood that noticed but stayed polite. and a boy who learned from every one of those failures that consequences were temporary, attention was conditional, and no one was truly watching. That lesson, absorbed over years of being seen but not reached, became the foundation on which Tyler built the belief that he could do anything and walk away. He was wrong, but the system helped him believe it for far too long. Evelyn was the one person who might have broken through. She was the one adult in Tyler's life who combined authority with warmth, discipline with affection, structure with listening. So she was the closest thing he had to a bridge between the rigid world of his father and the absent world of his mother. And she was the one who finally confronted him, not with anger, but with calm determination. She told him they would talk to Daniel about the money and the packed bag. She offered him a path back. She sat at the kitchen table and treated him like a human being capable of better choices. And for that act of faith, for that refusal to give up on him, she became his victim. The cruelest irony of the entire case was that the person most likely to save Tyler Mercer was the person Tyler Mercer chose to destroy. After the trial, several community leaders called for reforms. Better coordination between schools and juvenile courts, mandatory follow-up for repeated behavioral flags, training for educators on recognizing escalation patterns, funding for adolescent mental health services in underserved districts. Some of these initiatives moved forward. Others stalled in budget meetings and committee discussions. The system did not transform overnight. Systems rarely do. But the Mercer case left a mark on the conversation that did not fade. It became a reference point, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the distance between a troubled teenager and a violent offender is not always as wide as people want to believe, and that the time to intervene is not after the grave has been dug. It is when the first flag is raised and someone has the courage and the resources to act on it. The chapter closes with a question that has no comfortable answer. Would Evelyn Mercer still be alive if the system had done its job? No one can say for certain. Tyler's violence may have been inevitable, baked into a combination of personality and circumstance that no amount of intervention could have redirected. Or it may have been preventable. A different counselor, a different response to that first theft, a different conversation at the right moment. The truth is that no one will ever know, and that uncertainty is its own kind of punishment for everyone the system was supposed to protect. The flags were raised, the warnings were written, the file sat in a drawer. And somewhere in the gap between documentation and action, a grandmother's life slipped through. Jury deliberations are sealed. That is the law. 12 people enter a room, weigh the evidence, cast their votes, and emerge with a verdict. They are not required to explain their reasoning. They are not required to describe their doubts. They are not required to tell the world what it felt like to sit in a room and decide whether a 16-year-old boy should live or die. But in the months and years that followed the Mercer verdict, fragments of the jury's experience surfaced, not through leaks or violations of protocol, but through the quiet, voluntary reflections of jurors who felt the need to process what they had been part of. Their words, offered in conversations with family members, with clergy, with counselors, painted a picture of a deliberation that was nothing like what the public imagined. The public imagined anger, swift consensus. 12 people who walked into that room, looked at the evidence, and agreed within minutes that Tyler Mercer deserved the harshest punishment available. But the reality was different. According to those who later spoke about it, the first vote was not unanimous. Several jurors initially voted against death, not because they doubted the evidence. The evidence was overwhelming, but because the age of the defendant made the vote feel different from any other case they had heard. They were not voting on a concept. They were voting on a boy, a real boy with a real face who had sat in front of them for weeks. And the weight of that reality slowed the deliberation in ways that no legal instruction could have prepared them for. The jurors who hesitated were not naive. They were not soft on crime. They were people who had listened to every word of testimony, studied every photograph, and absorbed every detail of the staircase the prosecution had described. They knew what Tyler had done. They knew about the shallow grave, the staged burglary, the stolen guns, the flight, the lies. They knew about the dinner plate. They knew about the porch light. They knew about the peppermint bowl. But they also knew that the boy in the orange jumpsuit was not yet old enough to buy a pack of cigarettes. And that knowledge created a friction inside the deliberation room that could not be resolved by evidence alone. It could only be resolved by conscience. And conscience does not follow a formula. The jurors who voted for death from the beginning carried their own burden. They described a clarity that felt necessary but not comfortable. They pointed to the staircase, step after step after step. They pointed to the lack of remorse, the behavior in court, the phone call from detention, the apology that named no one. They said that at some point during the trial, they stopped seeing a boy and started seeing a pattern of choices that were not childish but predatory, a pattern that demonstrated not just the capacity for violence, but the capacity to manage violence, to conceal it, to flee from it, and to lie about it with the steady calm of someone who had already decided that other people's lives mattered less than his freedom. That pattern, they said, made the vote feel less like a choice and more like an obligation. The jurors reached consensus after hours of discussion that included arguments, tears, silence, and at least one request to review the medical examiner's photographs one more time. The final vote was unanimous, as the law required. But unanimity did not mean uniformity. Some voted with conviction, others voted with anguish. And at least one juror later told a family member that the decision was the hardest thing they had ever done in their life, harder than anything they had imagined when they received the jury summons in the mail. They said they did not regret the vote. But they also said they would never forget it. The verdict was not just a legal outcome. It was a scar that 12 people would carry for the rest of their lives. None of the jurors spoke to Tyler's family afterward. None of them attended the sentencing hearing. None of them sought attention or credit. They returned to their lives the way soldiers return from deployment, carrying something inside them that the people around them could not fully understand. They went back to their jobs, their families, their routines. But the Mercer case lived inside them in ways that surfaced at unexpected moments. A news story about a teenager, a photograph of a grandmother, a dinner plate covered in foil. These ordinary things now carried extraordinary weight. The jury had done what the law asked them to do. They had weighed the evidence, applied the standard, and delivered a verdict. But the law does not tell you how to live with what you decided. It just tells you that the decision is final. The most telling reflection came from a juror who later spoke to a counselor about the experience. She said that the moment she would never forget was not the verdict. It was not the sentencing. It was a moment during the trial when the prosecution displayed the photograph of Evelyn's covered dinner plate sitting on the kitchen table. She said she looked at that plate and thought of her own grandmother, who used to cover plates the same way. And in that instant, the case stopped being abstract. It became personal. It became a kitchen she recognized, a gesture she remembered, a love she had received and never had to grieve in violence. She said the plate was what made her vote yes, not the blood, not the knife, not the staircase. The plate. Because the plate proved that Evelyn was still thinking about Tyler even as he was planning to betray her in the worst way imaginable. And that kind of love, destroyed by that kind of violence, demanded the kind of answer that only the most absolute punishment could provide. Tyler Mercer was transferred to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice within 48 hours of his sentencing. The transport was unremarkable. Came a van with reinforced glass and 2 armed officers, a highway that stretched flat and straight toward a facility most people only knew from headlines. Tyler sat in the back in shackles and a jumpsuit and watched the scenery pass without expression. He had been a fugitive driving the same kind of highway just weeks ago, convinced that every mile was a step toward freedom. Now the miles were steps toward the opposite. The road that once felt like escape now felt like a conveyor belt. And at the end of it waited a cell, a routine, and a silence that would become the loudest thing he had ever known. Death row for a juvenile offender was not dramatically different from death row for anyone else. The same small cell, the same limited movement, the same strict schedule measured in meal times and recreation hours and the slow turning of institutional clocks. But for Tyler, there was an additional layer of dissonance. He was surrounded by men decades older than him, men with tattoos and scars and histories that stretched back before he was born, men who had accepted their sentences or were still fighting them or had simply stopped caring about the distinction. Tyler was not the youngest person ever to occupy a cell on this unit, but he was close, and his youth did not earn him sympathy from the other inmates. It earned him scrutiny. A 16-year-old who killed his grandmother was not a figure of pity in that environment. He was a figure of curiosity and, in some cases, contempt. The first weeks were the hardest. Tyler had spent his entire life in motion, running from consequences, running from boredom, running from the version of himself that adults kept trying to force into focus. Now there was nowhere to run. The cell was 6 by 9 feet. The door did not open on his schedule. The window, if it could be called that, offered a view of concrete and sky and nothing else. He had access to books, paper, a few approved items. But the one thing he could not access was distraction. And without distraction, the thoughts arrived, not all at once, slowly, like water seeping under a door. The thoughts about Evelyn, about the kitchen, about the sound, about the dirt, about the drive, about the border, about the moment the handcuffs clicked and the story he had been telling himself shattered against the fluorescent lights of a holding cell. The guards who interacted with Tyler during this period described a slow and uneven transformation. He was not suddenly remorseful. He did not collapse into confession or grief. But the bravado that had defined his courtroom appearances began to erode, not dramatically, in increments. He stopped making eye contact with a challenge behind it. He stopped complaining about the food as if someone owed him better. He started reading. He started sleeping more, which the facility psychologist noted could indicate either depression or simple surrender. One guard said that the boy who had smirked at the arraignment and leaned back in his chair during testimony now sat on his bunk most days, staring at the wall with the blank expression of someone who had finally run out of stories to tell himself. His father visited once. The meeting was conducted through glass with a telephone handset. Daniel Mercer drove 4 hours to sit across from his son and look at a face he no longer recognized in the ways that mattered. Tyler picked up the phone. Daniel picked up the phone. Neither of them spoke for almost 30 seconds. Then Daniel asked if he was eating. Tyler said yes. Daniel asked if he was sleeping. Tyler said sometimes. Daniel asked if he had anything to say. Tyler looked at him through the glass, and for the first time since the night of the murder, his expression was not angry or defiant or performing or blank. It was something else. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been fear, or might have been nothing more than the reflex of a boy who finally had no audience left to perform for. So Daniel left after 20 minutes. He did not visit again for a long time. The legal machinery continued outside the cell. Harold Benson filed appeals based on every constitutional issue he had preserved during the trial. The most significant was the argument that sentencing a 16-year-old to death constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. This argument had been making its way through the courts for years, gathering force with each new case and each new study on adolescent brain development. Benson did not know it at the time, but his appeal would collide with a national reckoning that was already moving toward the Supreme Court. Tyler Mercer's case was not the case that would change the law, but it existed inside the same legal current. And that current was moving faster than anyone on either side of the debate expected. Tyler spent his nights in silence. The row was never truly quiet. There was always sound, doors, footsteps, ventilation, distant voices. But the quality of silence inside a cell is different from the quality of silence anywhere else. It is not peaceful. It is pressurized. It holds everything the occupant is trying not to think about and reflects it back without mercy. Tyler had once believed that the world owed him freedom, that rules were obstacles to be outsmarted, and that the people who loved him were obstacles to be overcome. Now the world had reduced itself to a concrete rectangle, where the only company was his own mind, and his mind, for the first time, had nothing left to lie about. The boy who thought he would never be caught was now caught in the most permanent way imaginable, not by handcuffs, not by borders, by the slow, crushing weight of time, with nothing between himself and the truth. On March 1st, 2005, the United States Supreme Court handed down a decision that would reshape the landscape of juvenile justice in America. The case was Roper versus Simmons. The defendant, Christopher Simmons, had been 17 years old when he committed a murder in Missouri and was subsequently sentenced to death. His attorneys argued that executing individuals for crimes committed as minors violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The state of Missouri argued that the severity of the crime justified the sentence regardless of age. The case had traveled through lower courts and appellate courts for years, gathering attention from legal scholars, advocacy groups, child psychologists, and families on both sides of the debate. Now it sat before the 9 justices who would decide whether the juvenile death penalty had a place in American law. The court ruled 5-4 that it did not. Writing for the majority, Justice Anthony Kennedy articulated a position that drew on 3 foundational observations. First, that juveniles possess a lack of maturity and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility compared to adults. Second, that juveniles are more vulnerable to negative influences and outside pressures, including peer pressure. Third, that the character of a juvenile is not as well formed as that of an adult, in meaning the personality traits that led to a crime may be transient rather than permanent. Taken together, these factors meant that juveniles could not be classified among the worst offenders for whom the death penalty was reserved. The Constitution, the court held, required that the law recognize what science and common sense both understood. Children are different, and different does not mean less accountable. It means differently accountable. The decision landed like an earthquake across the criminal justice system. 72 individuals on death rows across the country had been sentenced for crimes committed before the age of 18. All of their sentences were now constitutionally invalid. States that had maintained the juvenile death penalty, including Texas, were required to resentence those offenders. The ruling did not set anyone free. It did not declare anyone innocent. It simply said that the ultimate punishment could not be applied to those who had committed their crimes as children. The practical effect was that death sentences would be converted to life imprisonment, in most cases, life without parole. The moral effect was broader. It said that the law, at its highest level, believed in the possibility that a child, even one who had done something monstrous, was not beyond all hope of change. For Tyler Mercer, the Roper decision meant that his death sentence could no longer stand. Harold Benson filed the appropriate motions immediately. The resentencing proceedings were quieter than the original trial. There were no cameras in the parking lot, no signs outside the courthouse. The gallery was half empty. Isandra Killian appeared for the state and did not oppose the constitutional mandate. She was a prosecutor, not an activist. The law had changed. Her job was to follow it. The judge resentenced Tyler Mercer to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words were different from the ones spoken at the original sentencing, but they carried their own weight. Life without parole for a crime committed at 16 meant that Tyler Mercer would spend every remaining day of his life inside a prison, not on death row, not under the shadow of execution, but behind walls that would never open for him. The Mercer family received the news with the divided emotions that had defined the entire case. Some of Evelyn's relatives were angry. They felt the original sentence was just and that the Supreme Court had undermined the jury's decision. Others were quietly relieved, not because they forgave Tyler, but because they did not want the state to execute a child in Evelyn's name. Daniel Mercer said nothing publicly. He had already said everything he was going to say inside the courtroom. Whatever he felt about the resentencing, he kept it between himself and the grave he visited every Saturday. The law had moved. His grief had not. Some things do not follow the calendar of the courts. Some things do not follow any calendar at all. The broader impact of Roper extended far beyond individual cases. It established a constitutional principle that would continue to evolve in subsequent decisions. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in Graham v. Florida that juveniles could not be sentenced to life without parole for non-homicide offenses. In 2012, the Miller v. Alabama held that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, requiring individualized sentencing hearings. And in 2016, Montgomery v. Louisiana made the Miller ruling retroactive. Each decision built upon the foundation Roper established. The law was moving in one direction, toward recognition that youth matters, that the brain matters, that the possibility of change matters. Tyler Mercer's original sentence existed on the wrong side of a line that the Constitution was still drawing when his trial took place. History did not forgive him, but history changed the framework through which his punishment was understood. The chapter closes not with legal analysis, but with a human image. In his cell, Tyler Mercer received the news that his death sentence had been overturned. A guard delivered the paperwork. Tyler read it slowly, then he sat on his bunk and placed the paper on his knee. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He did not react the way a man who had just been spared death might be expected to react. He simply sat. Because the paper did not say he was free. It said he would live. And living inside the walls of a prison with the memory of what he had done playing on a loop that would never stop was its own kind of sentence. The death penalty was gone. The life sentence had just begun. And somewhere between the two, Tyler Mercer sat in the silence of a cell that now stretched forward not toward a final date, but toward forever. Years passed. The world outside the prison walls kept turning. News cycles moved on. The reporters who had crowded the courthouse steps found other stories, on other courtrooms, other faces to put on the evening broadcast. The town slowly released its grip on the Mercer case, not because it forgot, but because memory requires energy, and daily life demands more than grief can sustain. Children who had been in elementary school when the trial took place grew up, graduated, moved away. New families moved onto the street where Evelyn Mercer's house still stood, repainted now, with different curtains and a different car in the driveway. The rose bushes were gone. The new owners had replaced them with a low hedge. The porch light still worked, but it was on a timer now. No one left it on all night anymore. Inside the prison, Tyler Mercer aged in ways that the outside world never saw. The baby face that had made headlines hardened into something older, leaner, sharper. The eyes that had once scanned courtrooms for an audience now settled into the flat gaze of long-term incarceration. He kept to himself mostly. He read books from the prison library. He enrolled in educational programs when they were available. He wrote in a journal that no one outside the facility ever read. The guards who had watched him arrive as a swaggering teenager now watched him move through the routine of a man who had learned that routine was the only thing the institution offered. Not hope, not redemption, not forgiveness. Just the next hour and the next, and the next, stretched out toward a horizon that never got any closer. He thought about Evelyn, not constantly, not in the dramatic way that movies depict remorse, but in the quiet, involuntary way that trauma surfaces when the mind has nothing else to occupy it. He would be reading a book, and a line about a grandmother would stop him cold. He would smell something from the kitchen that reminded him of pot roast and feel his stomach clench. He would lie on his bunk at night and remember the weight of the shovel in his hands and the sound of dirt falling on fabric. These were not memories he chose to revisit. They chose him, and each time they arrived, they stayed a little longer before retreating. The therapist he met with once a month asked him whether he felt remorse. Tyler said yes. Whether that was true or performed, only Tyler knew. And Tyler, for all his years of lying, may not have known either. Daniel visited sporadically, never on a schedule, never with ceremony. And he would appear in the visiting room with the same straight posture and the same locked jaw, and sit across from his son and try to find words that did not exist in any language. The conversations were short, often factual. How is the food? Have you been sick? Did you get the books I sent? Occasionally, rarely, they touched on something deeper. Daniel once told Tyler that he had been replanting roses at the cemetery near Evelyn's headstone. Tyler was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She would like that." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken to his father in years. Daniel nodded once. Then he stood up and left. The walk back to the car was always the hardest part, not because the visit was painful, although it was, but because the drive home passed through the town where everything had happened, and every familiar street was a reminder that the family that once lived here no longer existed in any form that could be called whole. The community that had once been consumed by the Mercer case eventually absorbed it into its larger story. It became one of those events that people reference with a shorthand. The Mercer thing, you remember that. Terrible situation. Older residents knew the details. Newer ones knew only the outline. A boy killed his grandmother, got sentenced to death. The Supreme Court changed it to life, still in prison. The nuance, the peppermint bowl, the dinner plate, the porch light, the rose bushes, the staircase of choices, faded into summary. That is what time does to tragedy. It does not erase it, it compresses it, until the enormous becomes manageable. Like until the unbearable becomes a paragraph in a conversation that moves on to other things. But for Daniel Mercer, compression never came. He retired from his security job at 62. He moved to a smaller house outside of town. He kept a photograph of Evelyn on his nightstand and a photograph of Tyler at age 7 in a drawer he opened sometimes and sometimes did not. He attended church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew where Evelyn used to sit, though he never sang the hymns. He cooked meals for one and ate them standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at a table alone reminded him of too many tables that had once been full. He was not a broken man in the way that fiction depicts brokenness. He was functional, he was upright, he was present. But there was a room inside him that had been locked since the day they found his mother in the backyard, and nothing, not time, not therapy, not prayer, not visits to the prison or the cemetery, had ever found the key. The final image of this chapter belongs to the passage of time itself. Seasons turned. The cemetery grass grew and was cut and grew again. The prison walls held their shape against weather and years. The courthouse where the verdict was read continued to operate, hearing new cases, seating new juries, rendering new judgments. The world did not stop for Tyler Mercer or Evelyn Mercer or Daniel Mercer. It never does. It simply kept going, carrying all three of them forward, one in the ground, one behind walls, and one walking the perimeter of a grief that had no fence and no end. The weight of forever is not dramatic, and it is mundane. It is waking up every morning inside the same story and knowing that the last page was written a long time ago and you are just living in the epilogue. This story began with a smirk. A 16-year-old boy sitting in a Texas courtroom with chains on his wrists and contempt on his face. He looked at the gallery like they were beneath him. He yawned when they read the charges. He leaned back in his chair and whispered through testimony that described how he had taken the life of the one person who never stopped believing in him. That image, that arrogance, that casual cruelty in the face of devastating loss was the engine that drove this story through 15 weeks of trial, years of appeals, and a Supreme Court decision that changed the law of the land. But the story does not belong to Tyler Mercer. It never did. The story belongs to Evelyn. Evelyn Ruth Mercer did not choose to become a case study. She did not choose to become a headline or a legal precedent or a cautionary tale. She chose to be a grandmother. She chose to keep the porch light on. She chose to fill a glass bowl with peppermints because she believed in small kindnesses. She chose to drive her grandson to school when his father couldn't. She chose to cover a dinner plate with foil because she believed he would come to the table eventually. She chose to sit him down at the kitchen table and tell him the truth because she believed the truth could still reach him. Every choice she made was rooted in the same conviction. That love was not a passive thing. That love was an action, a daily, deliberate decision to show up for the people who needed it, even when those people made it difficult, even when those people made it dangerous. The violence that ended her life was brutal and unjust. No amount of legal process can undo what happened in that kitchen. No verdict can restore the breath that was taken. No sentence, whether death or life, can rebuild the trust that was shattered when a grandson raised a weapon against the woman who had just covered his dinner. The law did what the law could do. It named the crime. It weighed the evidence. It delivered a consequence. But the law cannot heal. It can only hold accountable. And accountability, for all its necessity, is a poor substitute for the presence of a woman who made the world warmer by being in it. Daniel Mercer carries the story forward whether he wants to or not. He is the living bridge between the victim and the offender. I'm the father of one and the son of the other. He wakes up every morning in a world that contains both his mother's grave and his son's prison cell, and he navigates between those two realities with the quiet endurance of a man who has been trained to survive, but never trained to grieve. He does not speak publicly about the case. He does not seek attention or sympathy. He visits the cemetery. He sometimes visits the prison. He stands in both places with the same straight back and the same locked jaw and the same pair of eyes that have seen too much to ever fully close again. His grief is not the story, but his grief is the proof that the story never ended. It just changed shape. The legal legacy of the Mercer case lives inside a larger transformation. Roper versus Simmons ended the juvenile death penalty. A Graham versus Florida limited life without parole for non-homicide juvenile offenders. Miller versus Alabama required individualized sentencing. Montgomery versus Louisiana made those protections retroactive. Each ruling carried the weight of cases like Tyler Mercer's, cases where the collision between youthful immaturity and adult violence forced the law to ask itself what justice truly means when the defendant is still a child. The answer the law arrived at was not forgiveness. It was proportionality. The recognition that punishment must account for the capacity of the person being punished to understand, to grow, and to change. Whether Tyler Mercer ever truly changed is a question only the walls of his cell can answer. But the law decided that the possibility of change was enough to stay the hand of the executioner. Sure, for the audience that has followed this story to its end, the question that remains is not about the law. It is not about brain science or appellate procedure or the constitutional status of juvenile sentencing. The question is about Evelyn, about what it means to love someone who is capable of destroying you, about what it means to open your door to danger because you still see a child standing on the other side, about what it means to cover a dinner plate with foil for a boy who will never sit at your table again. Evelyn Mercer did not die because she was weak. She died because she was strong enough to keep trying. And that strength, that stubborn, unbreakable faith in the possibility of someone else's goodness is the most powerful thing in this entire story. More powerful than the gun. More powerful than the knife. And more powerful than the gavel and the verdict and the prison walls and the years. He thought he would never be caught. He thought the blood would stay buried, the lies would hold, and the miles would make the truth disappear. He drove north with stolen guns and a grandmother's car and a teenage fantasy that the world would let him rewrite the ending. But the world does not work that way. The gas station camera remembered him. The toll booth remembered him. The border agent remembered him. The kitchen floor remembered him. The jury remembered him. And the law, slowly, imperfectly, but with the full weight of a system built to answer violence with accountability, remembered Evelyn. In the end, it was not the border that stopped him. It was not the blood or the badge or even the 12 strangers in the jury box. It was the moment the court gave Evelyn Mercer back her voice. And her voice, quiet and steady and full of the love that outlasted everything he tried to destroy, spoke louder than his arrogance ever could. The porch light is off now. But the story it illuminated will never go dark.